Week 5 of the fantasy football season, and here's the top 36 running backs I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Derrik Henry of the Baltimore Ravens. Derrik Henry, what a season it's been for him so far in the last 2 weeks. Over 150 yards on the ground with 2 touchdowns in each ball game. Week 3 at Dallas. And then last week, 109 total scrimmage yards for Derrik Henry and 2 touchdowns versus the Bills. So this week in a division matchup at the Cincinnati Bengals, where I think it's a good matchup, I think Derrik Henry once again goes out there and is a big game. Number 2, Jordan Mason of the San Francisco 49ers. Jordan Mason, what a year it's been for him. And Christian McCaffrey, who knows if we even see him this season. So already 3 games with over 100 yards on the ground. And this week, a great matchup with the Arizona Cardinals coming to town. So Mason's locked in as a top option. Number 3, Kyon Williams of the Los Angeles Rams. So Kyon Williams, he hasn't missed a beat this season, where he picked up from last year, even when Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp out, and where defenses would roll more attention, loading the box and trying to stop Kyrie. It hasn't helped. And this week, Green Bay, we just saw him get torched on the ground by old friend Aaron Jones. And this week, I think Kyon Williams goes out there, has a nice performance. Number 4, Aaron Jones. Mentioned Minnesota Vikings. Aaron Jones and the Vikings travel London versus New York Jets. Jets, we know their defense is solid for the most part this season, but Aaron Jones could do it all, catch the football out of the backfield, running between the tackles. He's looked healthy, and he's a 1-year prove-it deal after he got cut loose in the offseason by the Packers, and the Vikings picked him up. So Aaron Jones, as long as he's healthy, he's a solid player, obviously. And this week versus the New York Jets, even in the tough matchup like I mentioned, he's been a top running back this year. Number 5, Alvin Kamara of the New Orleans Saints. Alvin Kamara, it's been a great year for him. A lot of people thought his best years were behind him, including myself. But Kamara this season, he's come out and he's making all the big plays. He's catching the football out of the backfield a whole lot. In between the tackles, he's not showing any sign of slowing down. This week, I know it's definitely a tough matchup at the Kansas City Chiefs, but the volume and the receiving that Kamara could give fantasy owners, he's always going to be a top 10 option as long as he's healthy. Number 6, Breece Hall of the New York Jets. So Breece Hall, his yards per carry definitely haven't been all that great this season, but in terms of fantasy production, he's still putting up numbers, is Breece Hall. And this week, not a great matchup versus Minnesota in London, where their defense is one of the better defensive units so far in the first month of the season. And this Jet offensive line, I know it's good on paper, but they got a lot of old players on that line as well. And Minnesota's defense, I think they can make some plays and get to the backfield, but I still believe Breece Hall, in terms of catching the football out of the backfield, making plays. And let's remember, last week's game was bad weather conditions, rainy, and the ball was slick. So I think Hall bounces back. Number 7, James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. It was a game last week for Buffalo. You just look at the tape and you don't even want to look at it and throw it out after getting blown out in that ball game. So this week, good matchup with the Texans. Last week, we saw Tank Bigsby and Travis Etienne run for solid ball games at Houston. I think James Cook bounces back after a bad performance overall for Buffalo, and that's a good game. Number 8, Brian Robinson Jr. of the Washington Commanders. Brian Robinson really moving up the ranking board this season. And even with Austin Eckler there, even though we know he missed last week's game, he's getting a healthy workload, physical in between the tackles, and he fits like a glove next to Jaden Daniels in that backfield, where he's that big physical back. And Daniels, he could trick defenses with his finesse and make plays. So this week, I like Brian Robinson once again. I know it's not a great matchup on paper versus the Cleveland Browns, but Robinson's getting a healthy workload, and he's been a solid running back all season. Number 9, Kenneth Walker of the Seattle Seahawks. So he came back with a vengeance and made sure the job was his last week in the tough loss at the Lions in the shootout. 3 touchdowns, 80 yards on the ground, caught a few balls out of the backfield, and Kenneth Walker looked healthy. He looked quick, and that's what we know what Kenneth Walker could do. He's a home run hitter. We saw it his rookie season last year, middle of the pack year. Now this season off and running, and this week with a great matchup versus the Giants. I like Walker a lot. Number 10, Bijan Robinson of the Atlanta Falcons. So Robinson, he was a top 4, top 5 pick in most fantasy drafts, and the numbers haven't been elite, but still solid, all double-digit fantasy points so far in the early going this season. So this week, a middle-of-the-pack matchup versus Tampa. I know he's banged up a little bit with a hamstring injury, but I believe Bijan Robinson will play in this game. And I know Algier out-touched him last week, but I think Robinson, he's going to get on the field and play well, especially on Thursday Night Football, where those games are usually high-scoring. Number 11, Chuba Hubbert of the Carolina Panthers. So who would have thought Hubbert was moving up the rankings this quick, and this Panther offense as a whole changed for the better, unfortunately, for Bryce Young, with Andy Dalton in the starting lineup. It just needed a quarterback that could move the football down the field and make competent plays, and that's exactly what Andy Dalton's done. So this week it's definitely a tougher matchup on paper at the Chicago Bears, where they got one of the better defenses in the league, in my opinion. But Hubbert, with his volume, and Jonathan Brooks not coming back in the next few weeks, Hubbert, off the volume alone and what he's been doing, he's got to be a top 12 back this week. Number 12, Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. This week, a better matchup than last week. Last week, he didn't do much because obviously the game script, they were down 28-0 versus Minnesota before you knew it was this Green Bay Packer team, and they had no choice but to throw the remainder of the game. But Josh Jacobs in positive game scripts. We've seen good games this season, and this week at the Rams, I think it's going to be a positive game script, and he'll have a good one. 13, Joe Mixon of the Houston Texans. So Joe Mixon, he's been out the last couple weeks. He practiced last week, and before the reports come out of practice this week, I think Mixon returns, and we've heard he's day-to-day. It's a good matchup on paper versus Buffalo, where Derrik Henry just ran for 199 yards on the ground. If Mixon could get back in this one healthy, I think we could see a good ball game out of him. And remember, Mixon started off the year great, putting up big numbers. 14, James Conner of the Arizona Cardinals. I know it's a tough matchup on paper for Conner and this Arizona Cardinal team, but Conner's catching the football out of the backfield. He's physical in between the tackles, and when you're getting volume and a workload like him, I don't think the matchup is much of a big deal, and we've seen him have success in his career as well, and very familiar, obviously, with in-division rivals. San Francisco 49ers, 15, Devon Achane of the Miami Dolphins. Devon Achane, he was great the first few weeks of the season. His whole offense went down big time with two out of the offense. He was the quarterback that drove this offense, obviously. Everyone was getting theirs and making plays. And with Tyler Huntley and Skylar Thompson over the last couple weeks, we haven't seen much from this offense. Achane definitely dropped down the ranking board, where he was a top 5-7 running back weekly, now really falling off. But this week, I like the matchup at the Patriots. We just saw Jordan Mason go over 120 yards on them, and I think he could be decent. 16, Ramondre Stevenson staying in the same game of the New England Patriots. Stevenson, a physical runner. First 2 weeks of the year, he had good ball games, but the last couple weeks were game script and tough matchups versus the Jets in Week 3, and last week at the Niners, it wasn't going to do much. It was going to be tough sledding for Ramondre Stevenson. So now this week, with a pretty decent matchup in a game where it should be close between these two teams, I think Stevenson is a solid RB2 option versus Miami for fantasy owners. 17, Travis Etienne, Jacksonville Jaguars. Travis Etienne last week, we know Tank Bigsby outrushed him in that game. He still had a decent workload with Etienne. I think he's the better overall back, but I think in between the tackles, Tank Bigsby is the more physical and possibly the better running back. But this week, a good matchup versus Indianapolis. Their run defense isn't all that great, especially early in the season. The first 2 weeks, we saw Joe Mixon tear him up on the ground. We saw Josh Jacobs have a big ball game versus them as well. So Etienne, like I said, he's an overall all-around back. I know last week he lost some snaps. They said it was a shoulder injury, but who knows. But he's a number 2 back, I believe, this week. 18, DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears. He finally had his coming out party as a Chicago Bear last week. Was DeAndre Swift. 7 catches, 72 yards. Found the end zone on the ground. And he definitely was at jeopardy of losing his job to Roscoe Johnson or Khalil Herbert. But obviously after that big ball game, he held them off. And this week, in a good matchup, the Carolina Panthers coming to town. I think DeAndre Swift could go out there and have another solid performance. Number 19, Zach Moss of the Cincinnati Bengals. Zach Moss, he's been solid so far this season, can do a little bit of everything. And Chase Brown's definitely emerged as well over the last few weeks, where right now it's pretty much 60-40 split in Zach Moss's favor. He's more physical in between the tackles, decent receiver out of the backfield. And the way this one's going to go in division matchup with the Ravens coming to town, I think we're going to see more of Moss in this one than we see Brown, even though Brown definitely will be a factor, but they want to be physical in between the tackles and set the tone as well. Number 20, Jerome Ford of the Cleveland Browns. I don't think Nick Chubb's going to return this week. I know he's returning to practice and eligible in the next few weeks to come back, but this week a decent matchup at the Commanders, where even though the Commanders blew out Arizona, James Conner went out there and had a strong performance last week. So Ford, he's had 3 out of 4 games with double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues. We know he could catch the football out of the backfield, and we know he's got burst, and he's a home run hitter as well. So this week, I think it's a decent matchup in Washington, and he's a good option. 21, Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Najee Harris, it's been a decent season for him. Jalen Warren, we don't know if he's going to play in this game for this Pittsburgh Steelers team. But Harris, he's getting a lot of touches, and they got a lot of faith in him, especially offensive coordinator Arthur Smith. So this week with a good matchup versus the banged-up Cowboy team, but most likely Parsons out. Lawrence placed on IR. Running lanes are going to be open. And, this Pittsburgh Steelers team is built on running the football and playing good defense. 22, Bucky Irvin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. This week, a decent matchup for Bucky Irvin at the Atlanta Falcons. Irvin looks like the more efficient back in the first month of the season, especially in between the tackles, where Rachaad White didn't do much in that category, except last week where he went for 10 for 49. But Bucky Irvin got the goal line touch as well, found the end zone. And I think this week in a potential high-scoring game in Atlanta, he's a solid RB2. 23, Rachaad White, his teammate of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So I got White behind Irvin in the rankings because, like I said, last week he got the goal line touch and found the end zone as Bucky Irvin. And I believe he's more of a physical back in between the tackles, where White's more elusive and a better receiving back out of the backfield. Like I said, this week in Atlanta, in a potential high-scoring game, I like both running backs as RB2s, especially with the bye weeks. 24, Trey Sermon of the Indianapolis Colts. So we've heard Jonathan Taylor has a high ankle sprain, and the only other report is they're not going to put him on IR, but it sounds like to me he's out at least 1 or 2 weeks, is Jonathan Taylor. So this week, a decent matchup for Sermon at the Jaguars. We know he was a former second-round pick of the San Francisco 49ers many years ago. He didn't pan out. But now in this Indianapolis Colts offense, where they got a lot of good schemes and ways to run the football, especially in a good matchup at Jacksonville, where they've given up a lot of rushing yards this year, I like Trey Sermon as a back-end option. 25, Devin Singletary of the New York Giants. Devin Singletary, it's been a decent season for him as a New York Giant. Last week, definitely a down game versus the Cowboys, only 4.8 fantasy points in PPR leagues for Singletary. This week, not the greatest of matchups at Seattle, but we did see Seattle in week 4 get gashed on the ground by Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. But obviously, this Giant offense isn't anywhere close to that Lion offense. But I think Singletary as a back-end 2 running back could still be decent for owners this week. 26, Kareem Hunt of the Kansas City Chiefs. Kareem Hunt looks like he's the man in the backfield. Last week, 19 total touches in that ball game. And Carson Steele lost the job fumbling over the last few weeks, and Hunt came in, looked pretty efficient, made a few catches out of the backfield. The only thing, Samaje Perine did get the goal line touch and found the end zone. So this week, not in the greatest of matchup versus New Orleans, but volume will be there. I think Hunt's a decent flex option. 27, Chase Brown of the Cincinnati Bengals. Brown found the end zone twice last week. Good running back catching the football out of the backfield. And this week versus Baltimore, it's going to be all hands on deck, with their season still on the line, 1-3, because if they go 1-4 in this one versus division rival is the Cincinnati Bengals, you pretty much, I think, could kiss the playoffs goodbye. So Chase Brown, good running back, better receiving back out of the backfield. And him and Zach Moss, I believe, are a solid tandem. 28, Zach Charbonnet of the Seattle Seahawks. So Charbonnet, he was mixed in that Week 4 game at the Lions, where Kenneth Walker dominated, obviously, the touches and found the end zone. But Charbonnet, a better receiver out of the backfield, and he still brought that to that ball game. 5 catches, 39 yards, and he had a few carries on the ground. So this week in a ball game versus the Giants, where I believe they're going to control the line of scrimmage, is the Seattle Seahawks team, and Charbonnet is going to get some opportunities. I think is a back-end flex option. He's decent this week. 29, Javonte Williams of the Denver Broncos. Williams still looks like the man in this backfield. Now with Tyler Beatty down with an injured back, he was getting touches as well in this backfield for this Denver Bronco team. I believe be the leader once again. And this week, in a ball game where the game script should be positive, I think Williams goes out there versus the Raiders, has a decent performance. 30, Rico Dotto of the Dallas Cowboys. So Rico Dotto looks like he's going to be the man in the backfield. Reports have come out now that they want to really shy away from a committee, where we saw Zeke in the first couple weeks get a decent amount of touches. And in the last 2 weeks, it's been Dotto's backfield, and Dotto better receiver out of the backfield than Zeke Elliott. And he could run in between the tackles as well. The only thing at this point that Elliott, I think, is better than Dotto is getting that 4th and 1 or getting that goal line touchdown. But this week, a tough matchup, no doubt about it, versus Pittsburgh. But like I said, Dotto's a starter. And this Cowboy team, they're not going to want to drop back and throw the football 45 times in this one. 31, Justice Hill of the Baltimore Ravens. So Justice Hill, he's been a decent PPR option over the last few weeks here. Him and Derrik Henry, a nice tangent. We know Henry's pretty much not in there on passing downs or plays where they're going to pass the football for this Baltimore Raven team. And Justice Hill, the thing with him over the years has been health, but this season he's healthy. He's making catches, he's making plays, and we know he's got burst and speed. And this week in a pretty decent matchup at the Cincinnati Bengals, I think Justice Hill could go out there, have a decent performance. Once again, 32, Alexander Mattison of the Vegas Raiders. So this backfield, it's a backfield you don't really want part of. But obviously these guys, someone's going to emerge and get touches and make plays. And we saw Zamir White had a big workload last week, didn't make much of it, 17 carries, 50 yards, a fumble, only 3 fantasy points for Zamir White last week. And we saw Madison had some burst, 5 carries, 60 yards on the ground. So I believe his workload is going to go up this week. I know it's a tough matchup at the Denver Broncos, one of the better defenses, believe it or not, in the league. And they're going to sell out on the run, I believe, Denver, and force Gardner Minshew to try to beat them. So this week I think Alexander Mattison is nothing more but a desperation flex. 33, Roschon Johnson. The Chicago Bears, Roschon Johnson, number 2 back. Khalil Herbert, pretty much the running back, phased out, I believe, right now for the Chicago Bear team. We saw Johnson get the goal line touch and found the end zone. But DeAndre Swift got the job back, I believe, after the big game last week. But this week, definitely a good matchup versus the Carolina Panthers. I think Johnson will get a few touches, but nothing where he's going to get 12, 15 touches, I believe. 34, Brandin Allen of the New York Jets. Brandin Allen looked better than Breece Hall in last week's ball game. And if Hall ever went down with injury, Brandin Allen's a top 12, 15 option weekly. He's a big physical back, could catch the football out of the backfield. Obviously not scared of contact at 250 plus. He weighs his Allen. This week, though, a tough matchup in Minnesota, and we really just can't forecast how many touches he's really going to get weekly as Allen. 35, Tank Bigsby. Jacksonville Jaguars, Tank Bigsby looked like a more physical in between the tackles and better back last week. The Jacksonville Jaguars in that tough loss at the Houston Texans, where he had 7 carries only, but went for 90 yards in that one. So Bigsby's got explosion. They liked him last season, but he didn't really see the field. This year, we've seen 2 games where he's outperformed Travis Etienne on less touches. And this week is a handcuff and possibly a desperation flex versus the Indianapolis Colts. I think Bigsby could have a decent performance, and the 36th and final back I'm ranking is Emmanuel Wilson of the Green Bay Packers. Emmanuel Wilson, one of the better handcuffs and better opportunities I believe he could get in the league this season if Josh Jacobs went down with injury. And also Josh Jacobs, he's had a big workload early on in the season here for this Green Bay Packer team. So Emmanuel Wilson, someone to stash in 12-team leagues or deeper. He gets some touches where we know Matt LaFleur, throughout his career as a coordinator and this Green Bay Packer head coach, he likes committees, and we've seen it the last few years. Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon, and I think we're going to see it a little bit here with Josh Jacobs and Emmanuel Wilson this week with a decent matchup of Los Angeles. I think he could get some work. Wilson is the backup and change of pace back, so that's the top 36 running backs I'm ranking for week 5 of the fantasy football season.